Hey y'all, and welcome to Geospatial Experiences. I'm your host, Melissa Mayo, and I'm an Esri engineer on the product team. This podcast focuses on the application of geographic information. Let's go on a journey together with some of my amazing coworkers, along with Esri customers, partners, and distributors who are doing really cool work in the field of GIS. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Geospatial Experiences. I'm here today with Myles Sutherland. He's the co-founder and CEO of GeoCam. I'm super excited to be able to talk with him today. So, hey, Myles, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Melissa, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, thanks for coming on. I'm really thrilled that we're going to get to have this conversation. We've talked about it for a while, and I think people are going to be really interested to hear your story and learn more about GeoCam. So, we're gonna jump in if you're ready.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So the first thing we start all of these out with is tell us about your geospatial journey. So walk us through, what your journey's been like, and how did you find your way of becoming, the co-founder and CEO of GeoCam, of a successful geospatial company. How did we get here, Myles?
Yeah, totally. Definitely a journey. Um, Probably for me, it kind of started as a kid. My parents were or are geographers and social studies teachers at high schools in New Zealand.
Oh,
So
cool. That's neat.
yeah, it was cool. So I kind of grew up around kind of the education industry. I guess is probably the formal way I'd look at it these days, but when I was a kid, it was just my parents were teachers, and I'd go to the classrooms and sit in their classes as early as I could remember. Um, got to see them marking exams and stuff, and it was always something related to social studies or geography related. Sometimes outdoor education, um, and even adult and community education. So actually, my dad was really focused on the geography and the outdoor education, and then my mother was really focused on the social studies and the community kind of adult education after school. So I spent a lot of time hanging around high schools.
Mhm.
If I wasn't in the basketball gym, but yeah, just kind of through that got really interested in geography in general. I think like when I went to high school myself, I kind of always knew geography was the main subject. That I was like, oh yeah, check the box. I'm definitely doing that. The others were kind of forced on me, you know,
Yeah.
math and science and English and stuff like that. But yeah, so that's kind of sort of piqued my interest and um, spent a lot of time in the outdoors. So I was just always really fascinated with maps, and we're always out hiking. And my dad ran part of a non-profit. My mum was heavily involved, and the non-profit was about outdoor education and exploring in the wilderness and teaching kids in the outdoors. And so there was just tons of maps around
Mhm.
everywhere. So that was kind of the thing that really always interested me. Like, how do these maps get made? Like when you're a kid, you don't totally understand that process. And how do they relate to the real world? Um, so that kind of was probably my start into it. And university for me was kind of just like the next stage. Like I kind of always knew I was going to study geography at university. I was really lucky at high school. I had a really good geography teacher who kind of, continued my interest in it. And I mean, this is a long time ago, like dating myself, we had typewriters at school, right? Like it wasn't like we were using iPhones and normal computers and stuff. I think even, but so for me, like computer science wasn't really something that I thought about or was interested in, maybe until I got to university and kind of got playing around with the first kind of versions of digital mapping that I saw. And I think the university I went to, University of Canterbury, um, had a pretty good mix. Like we had a computer lab that had Idrisi, was like the software that we used to use.
Uh-huh.
I think that was my first exposure to like kind of GUI Windows-based kind of mapping thing, and then there was some early versions, sort of ArcInfo kind of world. But because I didn't have a computer science background, that was quite confusing to me. I didn't really understand
Mhm.
that stuff. So yeah, that was kind of the start of my journey. I got super passionate at university about GPS, like kind of when I first got exposed to it. I think it was at university. Maybe it was before then. I can't really remember. I know my parents definitely didn't have any like GPS devices kicking around. No one really had those back then. But yeah, I sort of got interested in GPS, and they took me down this path of like, oh man, I'm going to go out there and map stuff and actually start making maps. That kind of learning that process. So that was cool. Like I got tons of exposure at the university, and it just happened for me that the university I went to in Christchurch in New Zealand had all this equipment from Trimble, which was an American company. I knew nothing of it. There were some other students who were working with it, and they just happened to have an office in Christchurch. There's probably a bit of a story behind that. It's pre my time, but for whatever reason, they had an office there, and yeah, so that was kind of my introduction into, oh man, digital mapping is kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one way you start making that data. So yeah, I was kind of probably born into it at some level, I guess, just with my parents. But yeah, definitely just got interested in how do you model the real world, and kind of, yeah, sort of set me on that journey a little bit. I think there was definitely times for me like where I was trying to work out like, okay, well, what direction do I go? I mean, we all go through that, right? Like you try to make some decisions when you're a teenager, then when you're at university, and then kind of when you go to leave university, if you went to university. Um, I used to see through my university, not through the professors, but some of the commercial companies that would come and work with the university. They were doing pretty cool environmental consulting jobs, more like the application at that point of maps and GIS. So that's how I got exposed to, okay, cool, we can do some fun stuff. We can go map surf breaks and beaches, or we can map ski fields. Those are the sorts of things that I was into. How to get in the outdoors and do trail mapping and stuff like that. And then, yeah, seeing some of these kind of, I guess, graduates of the university who are running companies, environmental consulting businesses. Yeah, that kind of took me down this path of being like, wow, there's these cool jobs. Like, there's actually a full-time job. That's pretty interesting, right?
Yeah. Like, what can I do with this? Oh, I can go make money at it, right? Like, let's do
Yeah,
this.
yeah. I think like the first things I was interested in was like, where could I go surf? So I was like, yeah, I got to make
Yeah.
better maps of the beach. Where could I go ski? Um, Neither of those sports I was any good at, but I was really into them, kind of interested in it. So yeah, it kind of like just made me interested in it. I got exposed to the computer science actually more because some of my friends were in the engineering or in computer science departments, and they were doing things more related to building MATLAB scripts and things that were about detecting cancers and mammograms, or other types of areas that were kind of related to, in some ways, remote sensing.
Okay.
Kind of obvious to me at university when you were looking at what was being done in computer science, that there was a really big future in early sort of computer science, machine learning, neural nets that was being done in other parts of the university, but was kind of new to geography, right? So yeah, I sort of watched all that, watched these jobs that people were doing, was thinking, holy heck, I could go work at the city or the council and have a GIS job. That'd be pretty sick. Could work at a consulting firm. And then it just happened that one of my friends at university, a little bit older than me, he had actually worked kind of before he went to university. So he had some sort of real life experience.
Mhm.
He was really dedicated, way more dedicated at university than I was. And he kind of latched on to the Trimble relationship, and he started working at the Trimble office in Christchurch. And I think once I saw that, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, this is a company that makes products. That might be really cool if I could go work at that company. Um, Honestly, I can't even remember how I started there. I think someone gave me, maybe it was Jason or someone else, sort of got me into that space, and I started working at Trimble in a part-time job straight out of uni.
Okay. So just right
Software.
after you finished the university, you went to Trimble? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, which was pretty, I mean, like in terms of like being really lucky, that company had an office with hundreds of engineers, 10 minutes down the road. It's quite fortunate, um, number one, American company, two, pretty successful kind of startup business in its own right in an industry that kind of was still pretty nascent, pretty new, even though it'd been around since the kind of mid early 80s. This was like 2000, 2001. So yeah, I started as like a software tester, I think was my first job, which was just basically, clicking buttons. Um, and to be honest, that was probably like the coolest thing that I've ever done to this point. That's still the best job that I've ever had.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, by a country mile. Like when you don't have a computer science background, but you're kind of interested in it, to get thrown into, you know, a real world company that's building stuff with a whole bunch of really smart engineers, and you just get to go click buttons and do whatever they don't want to do. Um, yeah, that was pretty cool. I definitely learned a lot.
That's what I was
You know,
thinking. You had to have learned so much just from being in that environment with them and being able to be around and having conversations.
yeah, yeah, and it's really like kind of served up in a bigger company. It wasn't a startup, so it was like really mature processes, pretty rigid in some ways. You just kind of come in and are told what to do. It's kind of like probably being the junior person on a professional sports team. You're just like, mate, here's your document, go sit over there, start executing on that. But so not a lot of pressure, just more like go do the tasks that other people don't want to do. Um, a lot of engineers don't necessarily want to go outside all day long and just test things. They'd rather
Mhm.
be coding software and doing stuff that's kind of harder, maybe in sort of an abstract way. And then for me, it was just more interesting to take the equipment and go use it outside and figure out how the heck does it work. Um, so that was kind of the start of my journey. Once I got into there, then I was totally hooked. Like I was like, oh, this definitely could be really interesting long term. And at that time, also, I kind of forget, like this is making me think back that when I first got there, it wasn't like these were smartphones, all right? This was kind of like embedded computing, real-time operating system stuff. The history of that company in Christchurch, and I'll get this wrong. I'm sure people can correct me on this, but there was a company called Datacom, I think, was building all sorts of stuff related to calculators back in the day. And at some point, yeah, I'm definitely getting this wrong. Somebody started building kind of like how do you do surveying on calculators and using different kind of calculation devices in the field and whatever. That got spun into an acquisition um, that became the software part of Trimble Navigation. And then from that kind of grew. And so when I joined it, it was like, hey, there's this mapping and GIS group. There was a survey group that was doing kind of like traditional land surveying technology, but then there was also this like, hey, let's build GPSs for the geospatial kind of mapping industry, less about precision and relative measurements, and more about geospatial accuracy for cities and stuff like that. And it was also the start of like Windows devices, like handheld devices, like Windows. I think it was called Windows CE. It was like I think it was Compact Edition or something. Like I'd have to look back at what all that stuff was called. But there was a group building first versions of like how to put software with maps into these embedded Microsoft type devices. And at Trimble was about how to do it with a professional grade GPS. So it was like, okay, we got this backpack, massive antennas and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure you remember all that. And then there's like this kind of handheld device. yeah, so that was kind of got me into the thinking about how you make products. Um, and that's its own kind of art. Well, to me, that's its own art and science, very distinct from just application of geography and GIS and spatial science and stuff, which is also kind of fascinating. But for me, the two of those worlds coming together was really, really cool. And it was kind of obvious, like cell phones back then were, you know, make the phone call first,
Mhm.
text. Well, at least in the US it was that. In New Zealand it was the other way around. It was text message first,
Okay.
phone call, and then we used to have Bluetooth, and we would be like, I think it was early Bluetooth, and we would be like, oh, we could slave some data, transfer some data off these devices. So it was starting to use like internet map servers and stuff like that down into devices. So yeah, that kind of hooked me even more because it was like, I was like, man, one day this is definitely going to be all on the same device, the GPS, the phone, the compute. Um, so given that, that's what I should work on. And so that was kind of like the career, like, holy shit, like that is obvious, I guess, what was obvious to me back then, I think. And then it was like, right, I should definitely keep doing this. And yeah, like most
So
of the product companies, yeah, that's a cool company. There's a lot of places you can go, you know.
so how did we get you from New Zealand to the US? I know you had a trek through Esri before you started your company. And so how did you transition and go through all the things?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because it was a US company,
Hmm.
um, at some point there was an opportunity to move to the US. Got transferred. There was a couple of folk who were kind of my managers, Alwyn McLaughlin and some others that kind of supported me on that. And yeah, that was always kind of interesting to go live in the US. I think I was thinking maybe the UK, go drink some beer, go skiing, like
Yeah.
Kiwis do. You know, that's kind of the default. It's really easy to get your visa, kind of do
Yeah.
that. It's really hard to get into the US. So yeah, again, just super lucky that it was a US company and they were willing to transfer me over. So yeah, I worked in the US for a couple of years for Trimble. Um, and that was great. There was tons of mergers and acquisitions going on. Got to see a lot of that start to happen inside of a company, which was really fascinating to just watch as a junior kid, basically. And then got really interested in what Esri was doing. Like I'd always worked with Esri. We were building at Trimble, like yeah, there was Trimble products, but then there was also integrations into Esri. Like there was a thing called GPS Analyst, which was like trying to put GPS processing with ArcGIS, or there was GPS Correct. I think it was working with ArcPad, which was a product built out of Melbourne in Australia by a company called MapTel that Esri had a partnership with and would rebrand it as ArcPad or whatever. So yeah, I was kind of doing that at Trimble, and I think Trimble had a hiring freeze, right? It was just kind of like there'd been the .com bust, there'd been kind of the start of the post um, kind of 9/11
Mhm.
stuff. So GPS stocks had done really, really well, I think, as a result of that. And then whenever there was a hiring freeze and there was jobs at Esri, um, and I got really interested in a project that was going on inside of Esri, which I think the code name was called Hightower, which I think it was, well, I do know it was Jeff Jackson and a few others who were, and Jeff Shaner and others that were involved, Fred Aubrey. They were building like a kind of like a new kind of Windows application. And one of the ideas was like, hey, this could work on phones and it could deal with offline, online maps. Um, and so it was sort of early genesis of probably a lot of what the collector and the field maps type stuff is today, but a long time ago. So yeah, I ended up working at Esri. Um, Started out in product engineering, working with Jeff Shaner, um, Clint Brown, yeah, Fred Aubrey, and a whole bunch of other folk who doing cool stuff there. And yeah, did that. Ended up working product management roles. Ended up doing probably 9.5 years at Esri. Spent some time in the business team working on the partnerships team, which was really cool. That was fun to get sort of out of engineering and into like more of the business and how the business actually operated. And at some point started working on the startup program. I think, man, I'm definitely losing track of the years, but started working on kind of a program for startups and how they would access geospatial technology. It wasn't
I was
really
gonna,
easy way.
yeah, didn't you help start the startup program basically? Or was it already going and you just helped give it some more traction?
Yeah, I think there was lots of ideas and lots of creative ideas. The business models were changing a lot back then. There was no
Hmm.
ArcGIS Online, right? This was sort of like there was ArcGIS Desktop and ArcGIS Server had come to fruition and was getting pretty mature. But it was still pretty complicated and hard, I think, operationally for a small startup that has, no money, but really interested in potentially using geospatial technology, probably using some open source stuff just because they could download it, start working with it. And yeah, there wasn't really a super simple way. Um, I mean, Esri had always worked with tons of startups. Like even when I was first at the company, we met the folk from Waze and others, but there wasn't really a formal way of doing that. So yeah, so I ended up working with SJ Camerata. He was part of starting startup program, um, and yeah, and then a few other folk got involved. So we had a small team, myself, Kurt Daradix, and Eden Kane. Um, yeah, and we just started trying to figure out how to help startups work with the technology, and that was super fascinating. Like that's its own whole interesting discussion. Really broad range of companies, which was the cool thing about it. Like the traditional kind of application of GIS was very strong in land management, you know, environmental management, population analysis, the human geography stuff. But sometimes it was, the data was still reasonably limited. And then we'd see these startups who were doing some pretty interesting things. Like, I don't know if this is a good subject for now, but you can stop me
Go
if you
for it.
want. I'll pull a few out. Like we had people building like citizen engagement kind of applications that were thinking like, oh, people can report potholes and stuff like that. Needs to go on the map, needs to be associated to a city or a county. Like, how do you route that issue to the right person? Um, Maybe there's kind of a map service in the cloud that makes decisions about where those issues get reported to the right administrative, uh, authority or whatever. Um, Stuff like that. Or there was sort of early generation of drones spinning up and people thinking about photos being taken on drones and how to turn it into something useful. Balloons, all sorts of things, right? And that was really different, right? Like traditional aerial imagery up until that point had been very much about like planes and state level stuff. And yeah, there were people flying small captures on helicopters and planes, but they were quite stable. GPS, IMU, big cameras, pretty big commitment. And then someone starts turning a radio controlled plane into a drone and they're like, oh, let's stick some cameras on it. And it's like a DSLR. That's quite a different proposition of how to deal with that. And then at the other extreme, you had really fascinating stuff that I knew nothing about, like probably really kind of relevant to what's coming up, where you started having all these companies who were doing voter management. And something I'd never thought about, but it was really interesting. They were like, oh, we got to go out and canvass, the local district. We need to
Mhm.
track who we're interviewing and we want to tie it to maps and we want to tie it to the voter file. And, as a New Zealander, I'd never even heard of the voter file. So I was like, oh, what's this thing? That's kind of interesting. Um, and so, yeah, that startup program and that job for me was really, really, really powerful because I got to see all these entrepreneurs doing really, really interesting stuff. And often in a quite a stressful situation. The stress has been generated by themselves. They've decided to start a company. They're probably doing it because the mission is what's important to them. Sometimes it's the financial aspects of it. Often it's both coming together. Most of them had never heard of Esri. Um,
Really?
yeah, no idea. Like we would go run exhibits at like startup shows, TechCrunch, Disrupt, or these different festivals, and we would have a little exhibit and we would try to market to startups, which was kind of funny because if you think about it, like other companies doing this were quite big companies. It was the Googles and the others, and then Esri was participating. And the kind of goal was just to be, honestly, just to be present, be a good member of the community, have a way for people who needed access to the technology to get access to it. And yeah, so that was really, really fascinating. Totally different way to deal with onboarding somebody and learning the technology. Really, really different to enterprise sales.
Yeah, I
Like,
would imagine. Hmm.
years of history and experience and stuff of how you do that. And then you've got these folk who are trying to move really, really fast. They just want to download your stuff and go do something with it. And yeah, a lot's changed, right? Like if you look now, there's so many options. People can go get online cloud-based developer services. They can download software and get moving with it a lot easier. Yeah. So for me personally, like as part of my journey, that was really, really cool because it kind of gave me a little bit of insight to like, oh, this is how people make companies. These are some of the things that look like they're working. I would say even in my job back then, it's really hard to tell what was actually working and not working inside of a company that's really small, 2, 12, 20 people. Um, but that was sort of like one of the pieces that got me interested in this idea of like, oh man, maybe I could go work in a startup. It's definitely going to be less stable, less secure, a lot more hectic than what I had been doing at Esri or at Trimble. But it was definitely fascinating to me. And I figured I'm living in the US, might as well go get involved and yeah, see if there's something fun to do. So I actually, when I left Esri, I actually worked at a robotics company.
Okay.
Um, yeah, company was called RF Spot, and the company ended up failing, went bankrupt not too long after I joined. So if I was like, if someone was like, hey, was you picking a company that you thought was going to succeed? What are the metrics for that? I definitely had no experience or understanding of that. Like what I thought I knew was correct was definitely not. But it was really fun to go work in that company and just see how they were building their product, how much more chaotic that was than having been inside of a bigger company. And honestly, that company probably was building too much technology. But general idea was, hey, originally started off actually as a Wi-Fi location technology company that would scan with a cart, would scan in a building Wi-Fi antennas and build kind of like a map, basically a map of the signal strength of the Wi-Fi antennas. And from that, on the phone, you could correlate from the current antennas that you were seeing at that location to the map in the server. And so it could report back like, oh, okay, you're roughly in this location in the store. So that's what it started off as. And like a lot of good startups, it pivoted pretty quickly when it saw some bigger opportunities.
Mhm.
Um, so it did some pretty interesting projects. Like one of the first things, I mean, this started before I joined, but it was scanning every Walmart in the country.
Okay.
I think there was like 1,600 Walmarts, and they actually made an indoor map of every Walmart. This was like 2014, something like that. And yeah, made these indoor maps and indoor positioning. So, that was pretty like, that was kind of like early days of thinking about what's the future of indoor mapping. And obviously it had been going on for decades in all sorts of different forms, but to see it get done at that scale with a machine and scanning a building was also really interesting to go, okay, man, this has got the same problems as the outdoors. Like, number one, the CAD files are out of date. uh, they definitely don't represent the real world. Number two, using a scanner is a really cool way to go and get updated data. Yes, you could have surveyed this stuff, but the cost and the speed of surveying doesn't really make sense. So running this mobile scanner through, it was LiDAR based with Wi-Fi, was pretty interesting. But yeah, then it became obvious that, like, I think to the founder of the company that, like, man, like, wireless networks are so crucial to consumers in the building. The maps are really critical to making this work. But maybe the future of this is actually like robotic systems cruising around doing jobs that people don't want to do. So yeah, RSpot became this, I don't know if it was an early Gen 1 or Gen 2, I don't know what you'd call it, but it worked with a company called Suitable, which was building sort of like a drivetrain robotic system on wheels that had an early version of the robotic operating system in it. And RSpot was like, okay, we can make the maps of the building, and now we can start to drive this effectively machine around the building. And so that company actually added all sorts of different sensors into the machine. Like, it would actually run cameras, take photographs of like the shelves in a store. Because that wasn't hard enough, it also ran RFID.
Okay.
They actually ran RFID antennas, like an array of them, 3 on each side, quite powerful antennas. So if you turn them on, they scanned the entire store in a second and basically read every RFID tag in the store. You didn't know where they were. So once the robot then navigated around, drove around each aisle, it had some clustering algorithms. Yeah, and what was kind of, maybe just to tie that back to Esri, what was really fascinating there was a couple of folk. There's a guy by the name of Mike Brown who worked on using ArcGIS to build the data management system and some open source technology to store the map data, which included actually building indoor routing. So he was actually building like a network graph inside of Network Analyst. And that was being used by the robotics system to automate its driving.
Neat.
Yeah, so quite a fascinating application of all of this stuff, like when I look back and I'm like, wow, it started with GPS and outdoors, ended up getting work on this indoor stuff. And yeah, so that was kind of our spot. Yeah, so that was really fascinating. There's not much information about that company out there. It didn't last too long. Tons of other companies are doing this now. You see those machines inside of, Whole Foods or whatever. And I guess, if you look at what Elon is doing, these humanoid robots are kind of like the next version of all of this. And they are heavily driven by maps, like in some cases they make their own maps. Often that's how they're working these days. There's not a lot of pre-mapping going on, but
It feels like your journey has really been setting you up for learning and building your skill sets and building the things that you've been exposed to as you've moved along your journey and moved in these different roles. It makes sense to me how you've ended up being interested in the things you are as far as GeoCam is concerned. I've always kind of, because I've known you for years, and I've always been like, how did Myles and his co-founder come up with GeoCam? Like, how did this how was this the area, or why was this the area that y'all were interested in, and how did you kind of get here? So I'll let you cover that, but I just feel like hearing your whole story, it makes sense where you landed. Does that make sense at all? Does that track?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it kind of feels like that to me, where every time I was working on something, I was like, okay, there's something next. And, the areas that are interesting are the challenges in the technology. And then also thinking about the market for me and the growth and what the opportunities are to help people. So like, the indoor mapping stuff was really fascinating because it's like, wow, we spend all this time making maps in the outdoor world, and the point of them is to save time. Like that's the only reason we really make maps. Like not from a like I need to drive somewhere faster. Yeah, okay, Google Maps and MapQuest, and we could probably talk to James Killick all day long about navigation and the role of that stuff and how it saves time and makes things more efficient. But geospatial and kind of GIS in general, storing, managing, analyzing, is about making better decisions. But the primary thing you're making is a faster decision
Mm-hmm.
because you've been able to get the data into something really usable, and get some insights out of it. And that's about saving time fundamentally. And so like the indoor stuff was along that path where it was like, oh yeah, this is really interesting. Like if you can digitize the indoor spaces, especially retail, that changes really dramatically. Like if you, I've learned some things recently about aircraft carriers, which I think might be the most extreme kind of indoor space that we try to build and maintain and manage, like a floating city. But if you
Yeah.
come back to that, a retail store in our lives is pretty dynamic. Like you go in there and you're like, I'm looking for these products because I always get them. And then I'm going to cruise around and find some other ones that maybe I don't need, but I've been sold by the marketing or whatever's gone on.
Mhm.
All of that is fundamentally driven by maps and geography as a participant in all these things that are convincing you to go buy this thing, right?
Mhm.
If you show up to that store and that thing's not there, you're pretty pissed off.
Mhm.
Uh, and you're like, I might even drop my cart and go somewhere else,
Mhm.
right? And
When
so
they
that's
move
quite,
stuff on me, Miles, when they move my thing, because I'm here for the thing and now it's been moved somewhere. Like I'm not here for this.
yeah, 100%. Like,
Makes nuts.
yeah, it's kind of like when you go to the city and you're like driving around and you're like, oh my God, I forgot that the music festival was on and all the
Mhm.
roads are jacked up. And like, I'm like, oh man, why did the maps not tell me that?
Mhm.
Same thing happens inside of buildings. Yeah, so that's sort of always interesting. I think how I got going on GeoCam, I mean, I had an interest in background in GPS, and the thing that really I loved about it is that it's scientific endeavor. Like it's sensing, it's radio waves, it's atmosphere, it's quite complex at a science level. But when you boil it down, it's an artistic endeavor because at some point you've got to make a map that's going to communicate something in a way that's really useful to the person who's trying to complete this task more efficiently. So that historically, like the action of building the geometry of what's in the maps about the objects and then the cartography of it is also a really fascinating thing to work on, right? Um, and so for me, those two things coming together is what is actually interesting to me. Like it's not the science of all the radio waves. Like, yeah, that's cool. It's not the like doing cartography. Like, yeah, okay, I get that. But how did all of that come together? How does that whole system work, right? That's where things get really, really useful. If you can improve that whole process of sensing to building a map that somebody trusts and loves and wants to use, and you can continually improve that process, then you can have a pretty big impact on the world. And so kind of like GeoCam, I got really interested in photos. I mean, it just comes down to that. Like, wow, aerial satellite imagery, early machine learning, people were extracting objects out of satellite and aerial photos. But it was the domain of like, not the experts, like the super experts. Like if you went through all of the engineers and folk working across all the geospatial domain and you were like, right, I got to get folk who know how to build and fly satellites, fund it, and I got to figure out how to download and ingest, process, store, manage, align all that data. You're really talking about one of the most specialized domains in the world, not very accessible to people. But when you look at smartphones and the stuff that came along with cameras and digital cameras, that really changed my perspective on it and was like, okay, GPS was really cool. We've done a lot. Holy crap, what are we going to do with photos? And more than just tag a photo and store it, and more than just like, hey, we've got digital globe. What does this look like one day if we're all wearing cameras? What if all the cars have got cameras? What if there are robots that have got cameras? How are we going to deal with storing, managing, creating really useful insights in a much faster way than we've been doing? And so, GeoCam kind of started out this idea. It'd be really cool if we could take photos and we could run machine learning and we could start making layers of stuff into a map, like as simple as that. And so, I'd met my original co-founder Luke, and then Phil. I'd met them through work I was doing with the Esri startup program.
Okay.
And I'd met other folk working in this area around processing photos and things like that. And yeah, I just really enjoyed working with them. They're both New Zealanders, and so it was kind of like, yeah, right, we speak kind of the same language. That's really cool. And so we kind of got stuck into this idea of like, let's put some cameras on planes, helicopters, figure things out, fly around, shoot some photos, process them into 3D, or try to turn them into something useful. And so, yeah, we've kind of been on that journey. And then other folk in the team as well, who I met through other startups. Mike and others have been working in different areas. So we all kind of came together around this idea. It'd be really cool if we could make a device that was much simpler and easier for anyone to use. These days, we use things like, what if a sailor could be using this inside of an aircraft carrier out at sea? They could be scanning with the camera, and we could be turning that into a way to update map data inside of an aircraft carrier, or full CAD or digital twin data, kind of all managed in a geospatial context. That's now, like, we started back with like planes, and then eventually cars, and then eventually indoors. And then of course now potentially aircraft carriers. So I don't think I actually thought I was going to end up working on indoors. We didn't think we would probably get there. Like, we were like, wow, we can do a lot with planes. We were flying transmission lines, kind of your guys' area and expertise, trying to build models of transmission lines and vegetation and 3D modeling those out of just the photos. And then street-based captures started. And it was all the same. Like, we would start with DSLR cameras. I'm not the engineer, so it wasn't me. Luke and others are the smart folk who are building the technology, deploying them on vehicles, driving them around. We would process the photos and try to extract data. And so, yeah, we've just kind of miniaturized and streamlined the technology over the years. To the point now, pretty much anyone can take the camera, turn it on, collect some data in really complicated environments, bunch of machine learning runs, and can extract objects and put them in the map. So yeah, that's kind of the journey. And where's it all going? I mean, hopefully I just keep working on the same path. Like I really enjoy the technology around making maps. So yeah, hopefully I don't end up switching careers at any point because this is a pretty good one.
So, Myles, what kind of customers come to you for your technology? I just want to make sure we cover really well exactly what GeoCam does and what they offer their customers, and what types of people, what types of customers would come, or potential clients would come and reach out to you. What types of projects, do you work on? Let's talk about some of those types of things to make sure people know what you do and know what GeoCam can do for them, and if it's something that they need, they can zero in on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we are building really two components. There's probably a third actually. So we build these cameras. The primary camera is a 360 camera with the GPS, has integrated storage. It runs its own web server in it, and people can use it on drones. It can be mounted upside down on a drone. It can be mounted on a tripod on a car, driven around cities. It can go on an ATV, golf cart. I don't know, all sorts of other stuff. I've lost track of where it's, bikes, whatever. And then it also goes on a monopole, and you can walk it around outdoors, all over the place, cemeteries, parks, golf courses, inside of buildings, any scale building. The second part we build is software that manages that whole process. I think, like anything, over time I've learned how to talk about this technology. It's still learning how to do that. But these days we think about it like somebody works with us because they want to build a reality capture practice. Now, that means they have to know what reality capture is. Like, what the heck is that? That doesn't mean much to the C-level executive, right?
Right.
But what they really are doing is most folk want to get better data to use in their maps.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of folk come to us because they're like, okay, I need updated maps of my city assets, specifically for public works. Maybe it's the street signs, they want to map the hydrants, things like that. They'll come to us because it's a transportation related use case, about the road surface, even some design use cases. And of course, this can go into all sorts of different places. So like electric utilities, gas utilities, folk who are trying to build, electric utility network workflows, outage management, all that sort of good stuff. And when you think about indoors, I've always like the customers that work with us on indoors, everything, because from commercial real estate to gas utility has indoor space. And I kind of think about it like it's the folk who need to manage the assets inside of buildings. From a GIS perspective, it's kind of like GIS indoors because there's so many different use cases. But a lot of it is just asset management, facilities management. Where are these objects? And often it's an inventory. How many of these things exist in the building? How many are in this room? Or maybe exactly where they are in the room. And so that can be property condition assessment use cases. Somebody that's just trying to maintain their portfolio of buildings. Maybe it's an investor who owns a whole bunch of buildings. Maybe it's a corporate campus. Could be an electric utility that's got a big corporate campus and wants to manage that space more effectively. And of course, this all these use cases work in defense as well, right? So I was just at a Navy conference yesterday, and most of what we are working on there is either facilities related, it can be ship related. A large ship is, an aircraft carrier when it sails out to sea, I think it has 10 to 15,000 people in it. If you rank that in the size of American cities, it's a small to medium, small city, but pretty complex because it's got all the utility services that you could imagine or in this space. So yeah, we have quite a broad range of customers. I would say things that are growing really, really fast for us are utilities, especially the fiber market.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of
There's a lot
work
of
going.
growth in that market, so it makes sense that you guys are seeing growth in what you do
Yeah,
and what services you provide. I know when we first met, I feel like you were doing like substation internals type work, and you were working in that space, and just to see how GeoCam has grown and the different areas that you're now servicing, the different the different industries and all the different types of work that you're getting to do. It's just it's neat to see. It's neat to see how you guys have grown and just those the just all the different areas you've been able to move into, Myles. My words are failing me today. So
yeah. I mean, it's probably like, yeah, we tell when we work internally, we're thinking about like what problems are we solving, and those problems come to us from the customers and the folk that we engage with. Obviously listen and learn. Some of them we've known forever and are common problems in our industry that have always existed, right? Like this device is not a surveying device. It's a device for capturing imagery, and imagery in all sorts of places that, you know, folk like Google, Apple, and others, and the early generations of those street views and things really kind of set the scene for people that were like, oh, I need imagery is great. I can make lots of decisions from it. And how do you capture that today? You can't call Google up and be like, hey, I need the Google Street View car on Tuesday to come do my golf course. Like
yeah.
that's not happening. That's not what they built the business for. And so that's kind of like the sort of primary challenge that people have is they want imagery to make decisions from. Now you can do that with other devices like GoPros and phones. It's complicated. If you want to try to make that work, it takes a lot of effort to figure out how to put 4 phones on your car and get a 360 view, or how to go from a GoPro consumer device through whatever image processing thing that they built for surfing and try to get that into something useful for a business, right? So we focus on like how do you make it really simple for someone to go scale up, capture imagery of any space. And while that's generic, we do try to focus it around the purpose of the imagery is to support decision making about making maps.
Mm-hmm.
So out of it, you can make map data. And when you do that, folk need to trust that the data is really accurate. And so that's another big piece of what we do. It's like, how do you build a system that not only captures these photos and it's nice to look at, but most importantly, you can get an object in the map at an accuracy that you can trust, reliably use. So that's kind of like the second problem. And all that has to come together and be really simple so that it's like, okay, anyone could go deploy that. Now, the third problem is kind of more specialized into our industry, which is if you look at the way people purchase and access data, a large organization has to go probably source data from satellite perspective, an aerial perspective, terrestrial ground-based mobile on the roads, terrestrial ground-based off the roads, properties or dirt roads or whatever, like electric utility has all sorts of complicated infrastructure and rural back lots and stuff. And now you think about inside of buildings, and then you think about all the types of buildings, like substations to commercial office, quite different, water facilities. And heck, you can even think about generation. You start thinking about dams and nuclear, solar farms, all the generation stuff. They're all very complex environments. And so today, an organization trying to procure data for all of those use cases has to go to so many different places to do that, to put it into a geospatial system to start to make sense of it, that we're really focused on that third problem of like, hey, you could put these easy cameras on planes, cars, bikes, boats, go indoors, right? So yeah, that's us. And it's it's kind of where the journey's got to at the moment.
So this may be a dumb question, Miles. So would they hire you guys to come in and do the scanning and do the photo, do the photo collection and then do the post processing and all of that, or do they purchase the camera so they have the camera and they can do that if they need to multiple times in the future? How do they go about setting this up with you, and what route is kind of the typical route that you offer?
Yeah, so the way that it's done today is that our customers and partners subscribe to the system. So
Okay. Mhm.
they basically get a product that they use on their own.
Okay.
And the first version of that is that they get the camera for a period of time. And some folk only need a small area to capture, so they can come and get the camera for a month. And then they get effectively blocks of processing credits and storage in our cloud. And so, like, we have a partner or customer today that's driving cameras in parts of Georgia and parts of Miami and Florida, where they have effectively got a subscription. It's almost like a lease on the camera. They have the camera for a year. We're actually getting a couple of them. They drive them around, and every day they actually, at the end of the capture, the system compresses, uploads, and we process all the data in the cloud. And so they get back effectively their kind of GeoCam viewer, their imagery
Okay.
viewer, and then they can start working in that and updating data that they are trying to map out and design. And then from that software, they can actually in the photos map objects, so they can triangulate objects, make 10 centimeter accurate points and put them in the map, polylines, things like this. And all of that sort of in their workflow integrates into ArcGIS and works with all their feature services. And then they go into a much more complicated world of designing fiber networks and building permitting systems for fiber and etc. So that's kind of the primary way. And that works outdoors or indoors. So same thing for if you want to do your buildings. And all of that sort of processing compute is, we try to simplify it. So rather than worrying about how many photos the camera's taking,
Mhm.
we do it based on the number of miles of street centerline,
Okay.
or we do it based on the square footage of the buildings. And
Okay.
quite often folk have a good feeling of what that is, right? It's roughly the square miles of your city, or the fiber design project that's going on, or substation property and building square footage. So it makes it really simple. Someone can just take the camera and they don't have to be worried about trying to capture the least number of photos, because that's going to, minimize my costs if I do that. In
Mhm.
fact, you want the opposite. More photos that are collected just makes it way easier for everyone involved. A higher chance the processing's going to just run through perfectly, and then you get a lot more imagery to make decisions from, and then you could filter it out
Mhm.
and produce ways to view it that are more simplified than maybe what you actually captured. So that's how that works. There is a second model, which we're still growing into as a company. It's something that we do today already, which is an on-prem, kind of almost like an unlimited use, almost like an ELA model,
Mhm.
where we have folk who are using the system and they are using it every day. And this can be like construction type use cases, or it can be quite complex infrastructure where it's less project based and it's more like, hey, I just want to go image and monitor this space constantly. And that constantly could be once a month or once a week, or 4 places, across the site, whatever, during a day. And those models are a bit more custom, and it is often tied to the square footage, and we kind of work out just the utilization of it. And that part of the business is developing really quickly because there are a lot of places in the world that people need to image and map things. And we think about mapping and monitoring, they're kind of becoming the same thing. Like if you look at it historically, it was very separated, right? It was, and I'll pick on the satellite imagery industry. You had kind of like Digital Globe, and which is Maxar now, and others build satellites for making maps because Department of Defense needed that. And then, okay, commercial companies, local governments and stuff start using that to make maps. Then you have folk doing monitoring, which defense industry has been doing forever. But you have companies like Black Sky and others who are thinking more about, okay, I've got to monitor the space. And they're kind of separate ways of flying the satellites. It's very complex to do one or the other. And the same's happened at the terrestrial level, where you had kind of mapping and surveying, and then you had kind of monitoring with static camera systems or just sending people out with phones, right? And they're quite split, because if you take out your phones and you collect tons of data, it's really hard on the back office to make sense of it. You actually have to train the person in the field to know a lot about how to understand the GPS and, you know, get into that world. If you send out the sort of super geeks, surveyors, mappers, they'll produce amazing map data, but it's harder to scale that into a monitoring use case. And so, yeah, these sort of like monitoring type use cases are developing really quickly for us, because the camera is really simple. Anyone can use it, capture a ton of data, can store, upload, and now because you can build map data from it, those two worlds are really fusing together. And we kind of see this in the construction industry more than anything else, where historically people built, there was the as designed and then there was the as built, and the as built was kind of done like literally at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really like, actually, yeah, as built, but only what I could see at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, someone else would have to comment on this. I'm sure someone else you'll interview one day knows more about it than me, but not much is getting collected during the build. And so that's been really hard to do. So our system is often used in that process. So now you can actually kind of look back and be like, right, here's where the pipes ended up. Here's where we buried these things, and that can be underground or it can be in the walls, could be a roading project, bridges, things like that. So yeah, that part of the business is really interesting and exciting. It's definitely putting a lot of pressure on the systems to manage and analyze the data. Because if you think of
through that a little bit more.
Yeah, if you think of the speed at which we worked in the geospatial industry, where we got like these infrequent updates from satellites, so we got send out the students with their GPS, or like the frequency was quite low. And then of course there's IoT and all this streaming stuff, and that's great. There's tons of really interesting systems and insights getting driven out of that. But if you start doing reality capture every day, you build unbelievable history of visual information that you can mine all sorts of insights out of. And so that's kind of the next area of opportunity as this stuff evolves. And some of it's real time, and then some of it's just way back. It's like way back machine. It's like, oh, actually, I got to audit what happened. Like, how do we go back and audit what happened? Debrief it, things like that. So
doesn't it
yeah.
always turn into kind of like a data management problem too? Like, how do we deal with all this information coming in? How do we store it? How do we manage it? How do we handle it? You know, it always loops back to that, I feel like.
Yeah, big time. And so you sort of have to get the two things working really well together. You have to have the field captures be really simple and reliable, because if you put crap data into your back end system, you spend forever trying to fix it. It's a disaster. So we're really focused on how to make the front end part, the reality capture practice and system, really simple, scalable, easy to use. And then all the storage and management side of things, that's evolving as well. And we're not heavily focused in that piece of it in terms of how to really exploit the opportunities of what this data is creating. At the moment, we're executing on customers are building project-based map data. They're starting to image things at a high frequency. Like this will collect 800 gigabytes of photos in a day. I don't know what Planet Labs collects out of one of its satellites, but like you could imagine tens of thousands of these types of cameras from us and others over time. The amount of data and imagery that we're going to have in our industry probably is going to outstrip dramatically what's happening in space. I'm sure others will comment on that who know more about synthetic aperture radar and all the other stuff that's happening in space. But yeah, possibly those same patterns that we're seeing happening in space, happening at terrestrial level and then indoors. Yeah, we have to think more about how we exploit that data because it's growing rapidly. And honestly, the robotics industry, which to me, robotics means autonomous cars, four-legged robotic dogs, underwater ROVs, you know, Tesla, whatever Tesla robots and Boston Dynamics things end up being, the amount of data that's coming out of this stuff is unbelievable. So yeah, that part of what we do, that's pretty interesting and exciting industry and area to work on, you know.
Yeah, and you've had some, interesting and new partnerships as of late, as far as I understand. So I know I saw you at the UC, and you had a very impressive booth this time, Myles. Like it looked like you guys had upgraded the GeoCam booth, and for the location on the expo floor and everything else. But you had the camera on the robotic dog from the booth next to you, right? Like if I'm were they next to you, or were y'all partnered together, or however y'all had that set up? But it's super cool to see like your camera on like the little robotic dog running around. You guys got a lot of attention.
Yeah, that was super fun. We signed up for the bigger booth last year. That's always a fun challenge as a startup, trying to decide like where you put your resources, your time, your money, and marketing, and is a big part of it. And we haven't done enough of that and enough storytelling about what GeoCam is and what we're trying to help people solve and all that. So it was really exciting to do that. And yeah, one of the areas that we, as we think about monitoring and mapping, almost becoming the same thing over time. Yes, we can drive these cameras around in cars and collect tons of data. You can do the same thing walking. There's lots of places that are really unsafe for us to go. Like just not, today we've seen people into these places. There's a lot of folk who do field work and risk their lives or in just unhealthy environments. So yeah, we partner with a company called Anybotics. They're a Swiss company, not dissimilar to Boston Dynamics. Most people are familiar with that four-legged robotic dog. This company builds their robotic dogs really focused around industrial oil and gas types of use cases. And I'll be doing them injustice here because I'm not describing like probably what they really have built properly. I work primarily with the utilities team actually. So I don't have full view into what they do as a company, but yeah, so our cameras can get deployed on top of that platform. And it's really good for constant monitoring and walking around spaces that you and I probably don't want to go hang out in very often. And so, yeah, these dogs are really capable. They can't, they're not going to send them out for 8 hours to like walk the streets. Like, yeah, we see the videos of that.
I'm thinking things like underground spaces, confined spaces, those types of scenarios, thinking about with the utility space, it would be incredible to be able to send something like the robotic dog with your cameras attached to it into some of that type of environment and not have to send one of our people, one of our, one of our employees into that. So I think it's an incredible area to be merging and moving into.
Yeah, absolutely. And like having worked at RF Spot after I left Esri, worked inside of a company trying to build an autonomous system. It's been really cool to be able to partner and work with a company like Anybotics. Like we're not trying to build the autonomy.
Mhm.
That's its own challenge, right? And maps play a huge role in that. Like that system will scan its own environment. And the way it does it, you have to actually drive it around first manually today. And you drive it around. So it's still an involved process. But once you've done it, it's kind of pre-mapped a space. Now you can give it waypoints and it will, like a drone, navigate itself around. And if it can't make its way to a certain spot, it'll try a next spot, or eventually it'll come home. And it has a
Mhm.
little docks itself and it charges itself back up, and then it can go back out on its next kind of mission, right? And it's a really good example of like when people build products, and I think this has been happening a lot in augmented reality as well. You get caught in this challenge of like, what am I building this thing for? What problem am I solving? And often you end up in this place of like, mapping is still pretty specialized. So it's like, am I building the system to create the maps for the machine to then navigate in? Or am I building the system to make maps for other people or other systems or other machines? And those are kind of two different challenges. So where the sort of partnership between us works really well is our system's about how to make the digital twin data, the map data that somebody wants in their GIS or CAD data, etc. And to do that, you have to move the sensor into different places. And it's different than, hey, I'm going to build a map at the ground level that the dog's going to navigate it. And so the two together actually kind of work pretty nicely. Our system's not used to drive the dog around. It's
Mhm.
got its own smart system to do that because it's got to figure out how to go up and down stairs. And I'm sure they're working on more complex challenges for it. But yeah, and that's kind of like, I see the same thing happening with augmented reality, right? Like if you look at the HoloLens, you could argue the cars have this debate going on about, do you use an HD map in your car and then you drive in it, or is the car just always smart enough to recognize the world and make its own independent relative space scene or map and not need a pre-map? The same thing sort of exists in the other robotics space and augmented reality. So like the HoloLens system was always interesting. You could scan with your head. In fact, the Magic Leap does this too. Like put the glasses on and scan with your head. Eventually, you don't want to scan the Esri campus with this thing on your head. That's going to take forever.
Mhm.
Probably get a sore neck, right? So that's where stuff like our system plays a good role. Really efficient at making these base maps, updating them, reference layers, and then things like the robotic dogs or the augmented reality can focus more on like, okay, how to navigate and operate in that space. So yeah, today we're not integrating really tightly, but I could see over time the type of data that we create can be used in these systems, make them easier for people to just operate. Yeah, yeah.
So, Miles, where do you see kind of the future of the geospatial industry heading? Where do you feel like we're heading with that? Is it some of the areas that you talked about already, or do you have some other thoughts on
Um, yeah, great question.
it? Put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big industry. It's hard to define it sometimes. I think like if I go back to like the foundational parts of the industry, at least that I know of, I mean, if Jack was chatting here or others who have got more experience than me in the industry, they have a better way to represent the foundational parts of it. But if you think like national mapping agencies, pretty critical part of the world. you know, the amount of data that's being created for them to deal with, you know, it seems fragmented. Like if I look at the history of like surveying and building cadastral fabrics and land management and property rights and all this kind of stuff, that's pretty well defined process in some countries in the world. That's still evolving and developing, getting almost easier at some level, but politically still really complex. So there's that whole part of the industry that I'm not really an expert in, but you know, it has to continually to evolve because it's so foundational to everything that we do. Just rights, general rights, property ownership. But then when you sort of step out of that and you start to think about all these like operational use cases that we have of like building and operating utility networks and roading and stuff like this, it does seem like we've kind of failed pretty miserably in creating good quality, reliable, as built or as constructed data. And as a result of that, we make pretty bad decisions. Like we build more stuff than we need to build, possibly, because we just don't maintain infrastructure very efficiently. And part of the reason is we haven't been able to collect data very easily. It's still quite hard to collect. So that's kind of our swim lane, that when we wake up and we're like, okay, what are we doing? Where are we working? Like, what's the focus? You come back to it and you're like, man, we keep hearing about the poles are breaking, things are falling over, the roads, you know, it's hard to maintain them. And one of the reasons is it's really hard to predict what's happening to them because we don't have really good digital data. Sometimes it's in 2D and that's great, but some of the stuff we need to do is more in 3D. And I guess I'm getting into 4D, like the temporal aspect of that. So I think like right now, the reality capture companies, us and others, you know, and there's lots of different sensing technologies for that. You know, people are starting to miniaturize and simplify and make it easier, and that's going to create a ton more data to help us kind of move along in how we build better digital twins and start predicting what's happening to the general environment, whether it's climate related or it's just infrastructure and that kind of stuff. And then, you know, at a technology level, the machine learning AI world, it's quite unstable at some level because it's a whole different jargon, a whole different language. It's a pretty complex space to understand, and it touches so many things, right? Like there's the obvious pieces that we deal with every day that are imagery based, like, oh, I can detect things in photos. Like that's cool, and we see that, and that's starting to have a huge impact in our lives everywhere. And often we don't even know, right? Like Amazon and others are using it in their products, but the same's happening in geospatial inside of our company, Esri, and many others. But then there's other places where I'm really fascinated to see what happens, like these agent-based systems where AI or whatever we want to call it is performing tasks about operating systems, like using the software. Like how much are we actually going to be building maps in the future using software and using a mouse and a pointer? Like if you step back from that and you think about it and you're like, wow, okay, that could be a dramatic shift if models start to emerge where they're performing what historically has been a pretty complex task that required a lot of training and expertise in how to digitize maps and how to make decisions around cartography, right? And so that's not something that I focus on a lot. I mean, I do think about it. I think it's probably something that's more in your world and Esri world. That's probably something that's thought of more than the computer vision. Like to me, that's way more disruptive than necessarily the computer vision at kind of like a remote sensing level. So yeah, I'm kind of just fascinated and watching what's happening there. It's already going on in other industries.
No, you're right. Yeah, I was gonna say some industries really seem to be taking off with it. They seem to be embracing it and running with it. And then of course other industries are just gonna be slower adopters. It's just how it is. So yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out for, all the industries across the board.
Yeah, like I don't have a computer science background, right? But what happened if I was 18 and 19 today and I'd done a geography degree? Back in my day, it was like AML and Avenue. It was like custom home built scripting thing, whatever, right? And then it eventually became industry standardized. Um, that was a big change. But now, if you look at what engineers are doing inside of our little company, they are using these models really heavily every single day as part of the actual programming,
Mhm.
all sorts of parts of the business. I use them all day long. Um, but if I was a geospatial analyst and I was like, oh man, I need to learn how to write scripts in ArcGIS or in QGIS or in GDAL or whatever, PDAL or whatever's going on, I would go straight to these large language models and probably start there and be using them really heavily.
Mhm.
Um, Probably learn a lot quicker. Um, so yeah, I'm fascinated to see how that plays out over time because at some level, the skill now becomes like how to prompt these things and then how to validate what's not correct. And that's a different way of it's a different level of thinking. Um, so if you're like training someone in the geospatial community now, that's kind of the first place I look. Like if I'm looking at hiring somebody, we're thinking like, okay, well, what have you already invested in understanding this stuff? Because it's already moving really quickly. So if you're not investing in that, well, that's probably a little tricky. You're probably a little bit behind already.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
Miles, how do you stay on top of kind of the current trends and where industries are heading? How do you stay on top of those concepts, ideas, the technologies, all of that? Because you're really busy and you're all over the place with the business and kind of promoting that and staying working with your clients and everything. So how do you keep on top of things?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty cool team. So just inside of our company in the team, there's a lot of shared knowledge. We have computer science, machine learning, AI experts, computer vision, on the business side of things as well. Like we have folk, Mike, who I work with a lot on the business side. Everyone's got their own kind of like area of expertise. And so when you start thinking about all that coming together, I get to learn really quickly from everyone in the team. Like that's one of the real advantages of a team like ours. It's smaller and everybody's having to collaborate really, really rapidly around what's happening. And as it relates to machine learning and the technologies, we're pretty focused, I would say, around making kind of imagery based these vision language models, understanding that, thinking about 3D. So it's still very focused. Like if you started asking me questions about what's going on in environmental science, and that someone today released some new model related to climate modeling. Like I skip past that really quickly. Like I'm not going to read that today. I don't have time to think about that. I really want to.
Mm-hmm.
So I might revisit stuff that's sort of more like personally interesting. That's more like evening or weekend time kind of
Mm-hmm.
reading. So I do try to keep up. And then honestly, I have some friends like who aren't part of our company, just in the industry that I collaborate with, who honestly like really push me a lot. They'll send me some pretty interesting articles about things that are happening in technology. Some of it's like honestly like way outside of the bounds, like it's biology related or it's something else. But yeah, try to keep up with just general trends. Um,
You
Try
never
not
know
to.
though. You never know when reading something like that's going to stick in your brain, and then you're going to encounter somebody, have a conversation, or whatever, and you're going to pull from that. So it's good that you have those friends that challenge you in that way, you know?
Yeah, yeah, like, and some of it's related, like when it's a small company, you have to think about the legal aspects of what you're doing.
Mhm.
Like, we're not blindly just building stuff, you know, like for example, like we build ML models that are focused on privacy.
Mhm.
And so, you know, blurring, taking a lot of photos, blurring people, cars, but other objects, and how do you do that? And why do you do it? And when do you do it? And what do we do versus what does our customer do? That's a complex topic. Or cybersecurity. Like, there's a lot of really interesting places in the world that we could scan with the camera. And, you know, how do you store, manage, and secure that? Cybersecurity is its own whole industry and really interesting area. So it is very hard to keep up in these other places, but you do just have to do it. You don't have much choice because you want to build a product that people can be successful with. So, you know, it's got to be safe and secure. It can't cause harm and things like that. So as much as it's like, oh, I could map anything, like if somebody's like, hey, like this has to be air gapped and it has to be used in a way that, like, you know, certain objects aren't identified. Yeah, we focus on that. So it's, yeah, the way I personally try to do this is I keep these mental models in my head, which is probably the worst way to do it. But I tend to make these models in my head and I see the picture. I like to draw things on the whiteboard and I'm like, these are all the pieces in the company, these are the pieces in the product and the service, and this is what's going on. And then in those areas, I try to keep up on some research and see, these days I use large language models to help me. Quite often I'll go to these large language models to help me do a review of something as a starting point. I don't always trust them, of course, but I don't really go to Google. You know, in the past, probably 5 years ago, we would go to Google, start
Mhm.
searching, right? And I'd be like, I don't know much about this topic. I've got to start on it, and then who else can I call? But these days, it's pretty amazing. You go to these language models, and they kind of make that first searching experience more contextual to us, put you in a better place to then start doing better research. So that's kind of how I operate today.
So, Miles, tell us how, or talk about a little bit, how can Esri best support partners and customers through technology evolutions? What can we do to make that shift and those transitions easier on our partners and our customers?
Oh, whoa. Okay. That might be the hardest question you've asked me. Yeah, I mean, I can speak from our perspective. Like, obviously, I was part of starting the startup program, but my company ended up being in the startup program, like as a member.
Yeah.
And that was amazing. Like, to be on the outside and now working back in that program, which was different than when I was involved. Like, the team had evolved it and become more mature and has different capabilities and stuff, which is really cool. That was really impactful for us. You know, like when we started off, we didn't go raise funding for the company. We just started working with actually just doing projects and whatever cash we had lying around, which wasn't much. Um, so yeah, to be able to go as a small early startup that's building a product and be in the program, get access to the technology was useful. Obviously, I knew a lot about how to use it, so possibly didn't need a lot of help in how to use ArcGIS, although the product evolved massively, right? Like since I left, which has been a while now, there's been a ton of acquisitions. There's dramatic changes in all the products. You know, it is hard to keep up. So the conferences are awesome. Um, you know, going in the startup zone was massive. Like, I would go by myself. It was just like three of us or four of us when we started. And as a single person, to be able to show up with your laptop and have this little kiosk and not have to think about like all the complexity of dealing with Freeman and insurance stuff that's really complex and all of that. And that's super useful. You know, we did the big booth this year, and you sort of don't realize until you do that how much work that is and how involved that is. So yeah, looking back, that was really, really cool. I'll just say this, like the worst part for me is being someone going to the events and doing the startup kiosks and not being able to go to the sessions.
Gotcha.
That's honestly like, that's not an Esri problem. That's just a like small company thing where you're like, oh man, I'm at this thing and I'm trying to obviously make money and sell the product and listen to what customers want to do, come and talking to us. But like, man, sometimes now it's a little easier. I'll go to more of the customer sessions and get to go listen to them speak. But that historically has been really, really hard, which is super frustrating because you're like, wow, there's like crazy stuff going on at these events that you can learn about. So yeah, and I think like we're now in the bigger partner program, and
You
we
graduated.
we graduated. Yeah, and that's been really good. I think like I work a lot with Frank and others who support us. We work with the professional services organization as well, which is really cool. So yeah, I think as a startup, the biggest thing is I think of the technology solves a lot of problems for us. So we use ArcGIS heavily across the company, and we use it to okay, so our product that we are selling integrates at a developer level. So we work with the APIs and things like that. I try to do that in a way that's really low cost for us. So we're not building plugins to the system because that is really hard. Like when the software changes and versions change, and there's a ton of products now, right? That's super hard. So we keep that simple, and then we run services. So earlier you asked like, okay, what do we do as a company? We do sell a subscription, but often we do run our own professional services. And in that space, we use ArcGIS to help manage, plan projects, execute on that. So the technology's got to be useful. And then secondarily, the company itself is really useful as a platform. Because if you think about the customers and the company, that's really valuable to be able to go turn up to a city and be like, hey, we work with ArcGIS. And instantly it's like, okay, sweet. This is way easier than like,
The other options.
not being the case. So that's sort of a general pattern for us. Like we do that in other industries as well. Like if you're in the CAD and design space, Autodesk is kind of a similar deal. Different company, different way, style of doing things, but in the construction engineering space, we sort of have a similar type of relationship at some level. Yeah, so that's great. And then I think like the other piece that influences us is it's kind of like a market maker. Like if you look at indoors, a lot of folk have been really focused on indoors over a long period of time, but since ArcGIS Indoors and things like that have come along, it's sort of made it more front of mind to a larger audience. And whether or not ArcGIS Indoors is the solution that everyone needs doesn't really matter. What it's done is it's invoked people to be like, oh, I need to think about the indoor space and the indoor environment and think more about that. And so that's got a slipstream effect for us, which is really, really awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and yeah, and it's like there's so many interesting products now. I don't even keep up on them all.
Yeah, it's almost impossible at this point,
Yeah. If someone started asking me about like geo event server stuff today, I'd be like, a few years ago, I probably could have answered some questions, but these days, no way. We're speaking way out of school. Yeah.
So Miles, looking back, you started the company, you helped found the company, everything. What would you do differently now if you were starting the company than then? What would you change? What would you do differently?
Whoa, yeah, okay. These are getting harder.
I'm sorry.
I possibly would start earlier.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard because the relationships you form with people have to come together at the right time. So it is easy to go, oh, I'll start earlier, but like maybe, you know, the guys and team that I work with were in different places in their lives, and so we couldn't have started earlier, right? But I think for me personally, I wasn't very confident in myself, and probably took me a while to get the confidence that like, oh, this is something that I could try and do. And not saying that I'm good at it at all, because still got a long way to go and still learning a lot. But maybe if I look back, I'm like, oh man, there was a lot of really interesting people who have been good in supporting me and others that maybe I could have started earlier. That's one thing. I think, Jack gave me some amazing advice and a number of times, and he does this with a lot of people. It's one of, I think, his most interesting, best traits is he's so accessible, and he will share his knowledge with people who are interested to go and sit and talk with him, and lucky enough to get that time. So, one I mean, probably Scott Morehouse also shared some of this stuff as well, and SJ, and even Logan, which I don't think a lot of people know Logan. But they were always like, hey, you need your hacker and your hustler. If you're starting a startup, you need someone who knows how to go hustle and sell and kind of understand and work with the customers. And then you need someone who knows how to go hack and can just build. So we feels like we have that in our company between our initial team, which has been great. But he also told me, go make money by doing data services and help people with problems that's not using the technology that you're currently building, and build kind of like a revenue stream in an area that's really related to what you're doing. Like not something totally random. So, and in fact, I think Esri did this, where you can do data conversion projects, you can do things like this, use other tools. Looking back, I think we would all agree we'd possibly do more of that, and maybe even have someone else in the team that's really dedicated to that and actually has experience in that. So like I worked inside of Trimble and Esri. I actually didn't have any experience in running a company at all, even a small one. Like if I'd gone and been part of a surveying business, that would have been really useful to think about, or a geospatial consulting business to think about, like, okay, working with customers, generating revenue off data projects that could help fund the product development, as opposed to like, go close the first projects and code and start building and just use your stuff on the first project straight away. Like you kind of want to do both, I think. Not that we ignored it. I just don't think I think what happened, if I look back, is like you get stuck in this first thing where you're like, right, I've actually got some customers, I'm going and I'm doing stuff, and you just get so focused on that, and it's hard to think about like, oh, I should be doing this other thing at the same time. So yeah, that's something that if I look back, probably would do more of. And we do that today because it helps. Like machine learning is a great example. Like it's one thing to build machine learning products and workflows and stuff, but you need to actually be doing the work to understand like what the outcomes are. And so we often are still doing a lot of data creation, applying machine learning as part of that process. We're learning about where it really impacts, where it has an influence, like whether that's a cost thing or it's a speed performance thing, where, because there's a lot for all of us to still learn about how to integrate these types of workflows. So yeah, we do some of that. Yeah. So that's probably the thing that I would change. Um, yeah.
It's always
Oh,
seemed like starting a business would be so challenging, just having so many different parts and pieces, and you've got to kind of be involved in a lot of it. So I commend you guys for, getting something off the ground and being successful and sticking with it for sure.
yeah. I think there's so many ways to do it, and I haven't even done it once yet. So I'm not the person to comment. I think like I do. You ask like what I research and look at. I do actually try to follow people who've built multiple companies. Like I think that's a very interesting group of people. A lot of folk build these amazing companies, and then it's hard probably for them to go and want to do it again because it's not necessarily an enjoyable process, like the impact that can have on you and your friends and family. But the there are folk who've built multiple companies. So you have folk like Jack who's built just this amazing company and it's still running and it's super unique and amazing lessons that can be taken from that. And then there's other folk who have built multiple companies, and some of that's really fascinating. Like someone who build a business, succeed, and then go and want to do it again.
I think
Uh,
those people thrive off that. I think they thrive off that challenge and the
yeah,
win. And then, they built this company and they sell it and then they go to the next company and I think that's sort of the driver for them too. I feel like they're motivated differently than people like us, Miles. I don't think I'm motivated the
yeah,
same way.
yeah. I'm not sure if I'd do it. Like it's definitely, and look, it comes down to who you work with.
Hmm.
Fundamentally, like I really enjoy the people that are in our team and I work with. Like hang out with them. If the work gets in the way of hanging out and doing other stuff, to be honest, because they're all great people. So that makes it really easy. And just maintaining the relationships with people is probably the hard part. Yeah, it's fun. I would recommend people do it, but it's like a lot of effort and energy.
Be ready for it if you start it, right?
Yeah, yeah, and just focus on like the relationship with the people you work with. Like that's like anything in life, that's probably the most important.
Mhm. So, Miles, before we wrap up with you today, do you have any last thoughts? Are there any final words of wisdom or thoughts, or is there anything I didn't cover that you wanted to talk about?
No, this has been amazing. I haven't actually done anything like this, so you've made me talk about a whole slew of different subjects. My parents would probably enjoy listening to this,
We have
but
found that the parents do enjoy listening to it, actually. Yes. The feedback has been, I actually understand what my kid does now. Like I actually get it.
yeah, yeah, they actually came to our office in New Zealand recently, and it sort of became less abstract to them what we do.
Miles, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. This has been a really fun interview. I know we've chatted about doing this for a little bit, so I'm glad we were able to get together and walk through your geospatial journey. It's been really interesting. So thank you so much.
Yeah, amazing. I had so much fun. Thank you for doing this, and yeah, I'll probably have to listen to it myself. So see what I said.
Absolutely. We will make sure you have that opportunity. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa.
I always enjoy chatting with Myles Sutherland from GeoCam. He's a fun conversation. I've known him for quite a few years now, and it's been great to see how he's grown his company. He really was influential when he was at Esri as being one of the people who kind of helped envision and start up and get the startup zone going to be able to promote up and coming companies. And then when he branched out and he and some friends of his started GeoCam, they've been in the startup zone for several years, and now we've seen them this year at the UC on the expo floor outside of the startup zone. And so they're in with kind of the main area there, and it's just great to see the company growing. They've moved beyond kind of those initial areas that they were working in, and they're branching out and kind of touching on some other good opportunities for them. So it was a good conversation. I really enjoyed chatting with him about that process for getting the startup going, getting GeoCam kind of getting it some legs and starting to run with it. The thought and the concept of having the idea and the experience he had when he was at Esri working with startups gave him a lot of insight for how he could potentially start a business himself. So I don't know. I thought this one was a really good conversation too. Myles did a great job of kind of walking us through a lot of the concepts of imagery and technology and capturing all of that type of stuff and how it's kind of transitioned and moved forward, how it's progressed, how the technology in that space has progressed, really kind of where that industry's been heading and where it's going in the next several years. So I thought Myles did a great job, and I hope everyone enjoys my conversation with him.
That wraps up today's episode. Please feel free to reach out with your comments, or if you have an interesting topic that you would like to hear, please let us know. Thanks again for your time, and tune in for our next podcast.